I'd like to welcome everybody to the City Futures seminar series. This is our next to last seminar for this term. My name is Lee Roberts. I'm one of the organizers, along with Richard Billingsley, who you can't see, but he's in the room. So thanks to everybody for joining us online and in person. I'd like to just start by acknowledging that UNSW is located on the non-ceded lands of Pichico and Gadigal people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to any First Nations people who may be joining us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Professor Hazel Easthope to introduce our speakers. But before I do that, I just want to start with a little bit of housekeeping. So first, if you're joining us online, if you could turn off your cameras and your microphones during the presentations, that just helps the presentations go more smoothly. And then at the end, we have two presenters today, and they're both going to do their presentations, and then we'll have a shared Q&A at the end. So once we get to the Q&A, feel free to turn on your cameras and microphones to ask questions or make comments at that time. But you're also welcome to put questions into the chat. Richard will be monitoring that during the presentation, so we can ask those questions of the presenters on your behalf if you prefer. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Hazel Easthope, who's the Deputy Director of City Futures, to introduce our speakers.
Thanks. All right, welcome everyone. We have an excellent lineup, two excellent presenters today. First up, we have Dr. Edgar Liu, who is a Senior Research Fellow at City Futures Research Centre, followed by Emeritus Professor Bruce Judd, who is an Emeritus Professor at City Futures Research Centre. They are two experts in ageing and housing and ageing in place. And in fact, this is not on their bios, but they have even published a book together, an edited collection on the topic called Ageing in Place: Design, Planning and Policy Responses in the Western Asia Pacific, along with Professor Kenichi Tanui from Kyushu University. So I'm very pleased to introduce them both. First up, we will have Ed talking on supporting older people ageing in place, and then Bruce will present on aged care in land lease communities. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Ed to start proceedings.
Thank you very much, Hazel. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a little project that we did a couple of years ago now, but we've only just published a paper last year to summarize one part of the project. And essentially, it responds to what the government has been asking for quite a number of years, is to how do you actually support older people to age in place rather than go into an aging or nursing home institution, where it's often assumed that is a lot more costly option. It's also a response to community preferences that they want to stay living at home for as long as possible. And so we ended up with this current kind of situation where roughly half of the people who require some sort of care and support service live in an institution like residential care, and then the other half living in a home care situation. But then if you look at the population more generally, of older people at the very least, most of them don't actually require any care at all. So if you take that out of the equation, how do we actually support older people who don't need formal services continue staying at home for as long as possible? And that prompted us to ask this question and did this little project that was funded by the UNSW Aging Futures Institute going back a few years now in 2019. And as you can see there, Bruce is also on the project team, along with our colleagues over at the Centre of Excellence for Population Aging Research, as well as at the Centre for Social Impacts over at the University of Western Australia. And essentially what we tried to do was to look at how policies and things more generally, retrospectively and prospectively, support population aging and meeting the needs of what we call the active aging population. So it's not just to provide things for them, but also work collaboratively with them. We did two things. One was a population aging matrix. So this is a quantitative element, which was an extension of Mariana's PhD. So we took it further than the geography that she did, and then also a longer time period than what she did. But what I'm actually going to focus more on today is the qualitative elements of the policy review. So how do we actually use policy to support these kind of things to keep people who want to live at home for longer to stay there for longer? But just very quickly, the population aging matrix was essentially a census data analysis, and it looks at the dynamics of different levels of aging at the very local level. So we chose statistical area 2 level, and essentially it looks at the extent of numeric aging, so how many more number of older people are in that local area, as well as structural aging, so how much of a proportion of the local population older people are making up in that area, and divide them into 4 different categories. So if there are more older people in terms of number, and they're also making up a larger share, we categorize it as an accumulation, so really concentrating in that area. But if there is more older people in that area, but it's a smaller proportion, it just means that younger people or people of other age groups are increasing much faster. So, you know, the needs of older people might be a bit more hidden if they're not as prominent. And so this is the kind of categorization that we ended up doing. And what we found was that for most of this country, to no one's surprise, we can be classified as accumulation. So most of us are having more older people in our local area who are also making up a larger share of our local population. And that is what an aging society looks like. What we also found was that most of these accumulation areas also coincide with what are termed auto suburbs or exurb, which are highly car dependent. So if you're not driving or you can no longer drive, how do you actually access the things that you need, whether it is formal services or just to hang out with your friends? At the same time, we also found at this juncture of where these accumulation areas are and where the changes in terms of formal aged care services are happening or increasing. So there is a different level, there's a different way of things happening in terms of who can actually access aged care services. So there's an equity issue. But moving on to the qualitative element, we wanted to see how current policies actually facilitate the needs for active aging. So how do you actually help people who want to live at home stay there and do a whole range of other things rather than just survive? We looked at it from different government levels because we have a federated government system. We looked at policies at the federal level, 4 states and territories, and we also chose 4 local government areas as case studies at the local level. All 4 of them happen to be here in New South Wales, so that they actually all work within the same policy setting at the federal and state level. But we did very specifically choose 2 that are in metropolitan Sydney and 2 regional areas of New South Wales. So we want to know if they actually make a difference. Geography makes a difference. What we also did was that for each of those, we chose 2 that are also members of the World Health Organization's Global Network for Age-Friendly Cities and Communities, which is basically the global leader in terms of providing guidance on how do you make age-friendly policies. And we wanted to know if membership to that organization actually makes a difference in changing the way that you provide policies to your local population. Because back in 2007, the WHO actually published a guide called Global Age-Friendly Cities Guide, and it provides detailed guidance on how do you actually provide for an aging population. And in there, it proposed 8 core domains that you actually need to provide in order to help older people live a successful life at home. And care and support services is only one of those 8. So there are much more different aspects that you need to cater to in order to help people stay active and healthy for a longer period of time. But as you can see there, some of them actually overlap a little bit. And to make our jobs a little bit easier, we actually combine some of those things. And on the third column, you can see are the 5 different policy areas that we decided to concentrate on. Now, none of them actually cover everything that the domains asked for, so they're just examples of how we're actually catering to those things. The middle part is the quantitative element that we did in addition to the population matrix that we mapped, which is how we actually find what any of those things intersected or not. So as I said, the project we did was in 2019, and we did this policy analysis in the later half of that year. And we did, again, 2 different things. We focused only on policies that were currently in play, so that were already out in force, or that have been published for public consultation, so that with the expectation that it would come into play soon. We deliberately excluded things like regulations on minimum standards because they are quite different things and not just policies. And we did 2 things to them. One was the textual analysis. So that links back to the international guidance influence on whether they actually take on board international guidance or in what ways that they do. And the other one was a detailed content analysis of what actually they talked about, whether they recognize there are any aging-related challenges that need to be addressed, and then whether they actually provided any kind of actions to address those challenges. So across the 3 levels of government, we analyzed 85 policy documents altogether. And the outcome of the textual analysis was that we tried to see if they actually mentioned any of these international guidelines within the policies. And as you can see, I'll just point out one thing, which is the case of South Australia and WA. So the superscript of B notes that they are currently or by the time they were a member of the age-bending global network. And if you look at South Australia and Western Australia side by side, you can see very clearly that South Australia, not being a member, actually had a lot more of their policies mention these international guidelines than WA, which was a member and still is. And so that led us to question, what is the actual point of membership? You're not going to take their guidance on board. And that is quite similar in the local government environment, where both Liverpool and Kiama were members, although they are doing much better than non-members, which is Sydney and Dubbo. And moving on to the content analysis, as I said, we focus on 2 very specific aspects. One is whether they actually acknowledge there is a challenge, aging-related challenge, and if they did anything about it. And the outcome, we categorize them again using different colors. If they did both of those things, they were coded green. If they only acknowledged that there was a problem but then didn't do anything about it or didn't propose any solution to them, it was a yellow. If they didn't think that there was an aging problem at all, and it was red. Also recognizing that we have a 3-tier government system, not everyone has the capacity to make up their own policies. So they might sometimes refer to someone else's policy, usually a high level of governments. So we added a 4th category, which is gray. Now, I don't expect you to read everything that is on the next slide, but just have a look at the colors and see. So this is the outcome, right? So each box is a policy document. Also noting that sometimes a policy can cut across a number of different areas. So some of them are repeated, but let's just focus on the color a little bit. If you look horizontally, so each role is a government. So we have Australia at the top, and then all the states on this side, territories, and then the local government areas. And then the policy areas are the columns. So let's go to jurisdictional analysis first. If you look at them horizontally by the roles, there were there wasn't really any kind of real observation in terms of the likelihood of membership, as I mentioned before, to how age-friendly the policies are. What we did find, however, is that more state-level policies were likely to be age-friendly than any other level of government, even though the intended audience of the international guideline of the WHO was at the local government level, because they would know their local population the best. So why is that the case? If you look at earlier findings from Edgar et al., for example, they explain that it is probably because of the way that we've set up our government. Federal government has all the money, but they don't necessarily have the power, certainly not in direct service provision. Local government, at the other hand, they usually don't have money, even though they know people the best. And they rely on the resources that trickle down to them from federal and state and whatever authority they are allowed to do in order to respond. So it leaves us in this middle ground of the state and territory government to deliver things which need to cover generally a pretty large geographic area and pretty diverse population, but without the intimate knowledge. But if we look vertically, things are a little bit different. There was a very obvious a column of green that are linked with the care and support services policy. And then gradually fewer when it comes to all the transport stuff, housing stuff, and then the least when it comes to recognizing diversity of our population. And in similar arguments to others who have made, this is our argument was that this is a reflection of what the government actually think of our older population, that they are debilitated, they need constant care and support. And that is quite a strong contrast to current movements like the third age and the positive aging that continue to recognize and champion the values and the contributions of our older populations. So there's a major disjuncture there. And that red column, when it comes to recognizing our diversity, also relates to previous research talking about the cultural blindness that our policy is not just aging related in this country, generally blind to our cultural differences, so that we don't understand the different processes of aging. We also don't understand the different requirements of people when it comes to having different populations. And so, a quick summary. We have this kind of siloed policy making and not recognizing the different needs of the people. We detract from the kind of holistic intention of the international guidelines, actually supporting people to age in place rather than just putting them into a particular category. And it's sort of the outcome of a whole range of constraints that Benson and Jordan talked about when it comes to jurisdictional. You might not have the necessary power to do those things. You might not have the financial resources to do those things, but also you might not have the political will to make those things happen. When you look at the policy transfers and assemblages again, a lot of the international literature talks about transfers and learnings from international examples. They don't necessarily, so in a vertical sense, they don't necessarily talk about learnings from a horizontal sense, where you might borrow, lessons from your neighboring local councils, for example, if they may have a similar population. So that is something that we managed to find, is that policy transfers actually happen in many different directions and at many different scales. So the final conclusion was that more recognition is needed in order to cater to what is essentially a multicultural society that we have. And things are starting to happen. So the Federal Department of Health, for example, has an age care diversity framework. Yes, it's recognizing diversity, but it's still only focused on one very specific aspect in service provision. So it's still not, it will still have some ways into actually actioning that kind of holistic intention of those international guidelines. As I mentioned before, we've already published this as a journal article. So you can see that on the right with the Australian Journal of Social Issues. It is actually fully open access, so it's not hidden behind a paywall. You can pay. You can read what I just talked about in more detail on the right. We also wrote a more layman version and published on the conversation in October last year, which you can see on the left there. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction, Hazel, and Ed for your presentation. You can see the title there, Access to Aged Care in Land Lease Communities in Australia. It's actually about a little bit more than that, suggests. It's part of a ARC discovery project that I'm one of the members of, led by Hal Pawson, and with other colleagues, Kath Hulse, Chris Martin, Edgar Lou here, and Perette Viroja from Melbourne. And the discovery project is called the Financialisation of Older Persons Residential Parks and Rental Villages. My task that was given to me was to do a literature review and policy review on access to aged care in land lease communities and retirement villages. So you might ask, why do that? Well, because retirement villages will be called RVs from now on. A more established form of retirement housing and fairly well known, well established. LLCs, land lease communities, are emerging as an important affordable retirement housing option. So this is asking the question, how do they compare in terms of access to aged care services? And to do this, we did a literature, policy and legislative review on aged care reforms and their implications for access to aged care in these housing types. We looked at state and territory legislation provisions for these housing. We looked at the academic and grey literature on access to aged care in them. And we did a little bit of census work as well. So what are the differences between these two forms of retirement housing? Well, retirement villages, of course, are pretty well known. They're mostly age restricted to 55 plus. They are self-contained attached dwellings or apartments, sometimes vertical villages as well. They can be in urban, suburban or regional locations. They're mostly loan lease or loan license tenure, and they run by both for-profit and not-for-profit operators. They have common facilities and most offer some personal services as well. Some are co-located with residential care, and they come under state and territory legislation rather than federal legislation. From the aeroplane, land lease communities don't look all that different, but when we look closer, they certainly are. They're a more affordable option than RVs. Some of them are age restricted, but not all of them. That depends on local laws in states as well. They consist of manufactured relocatable homes that are built in the factory, and the houses are owned, but the sites are leased. They do have some common facilities. That depends on whether they're pitching it at an affordable market or an expensive market. They're run mostly or pretty well solely by for-profit owner-operators. They also come under state and territory legislation rather than federal, and residents qualify for Commonwealth rent assistance if they meet the income criteria. By the way, that I should go back there. That little red circle there is where my brother lives on this particular one, so I had a few insights into that one. When we look at the age profile, this is what it looks like. But before I do that, I want to just remind us that the vast majority of older Australians 65 and over are actually living in private dwellings. But that definition actually includes land lease communities, and retirement villages are still classified as private dwellings. We look at the percentage of people aged 65 and over. We find that 5.2% of them are in self-contained retirement villages based on census data, and only 0.2 in manufactured home estates. So it's a much less percentage. And I should add that these figures are a bit questionable because the categorisation system in the ABS is not all that good in terms of differentiating between retirement villages and manufactured home estates, as they call them, which are the same as LLCs. And what that means is that they're probably undercounted, and possibly the age profile is older than what indicates on the graph here. In self-contained retirement villages, pretty well all of the residents are age 65 and over. Whereas in MHEs it's less, but it's still quite significant. It's still more than half are age 65 and over, and 50. And if we look at 50 and over, it's 3/4. And we know from the census data also that 15.7% of those aged 65 and over in these manufactured home estates are in need of assistance. And 21% of those 75 and over in these estates are in need of assistance as well. So that begs the question, what is the suitability of them for ageing in place and their access to aged care services? Now, if you look at the profile there, you'll see that age profile. The blue lines represents LLCs, or manufactured home estates as they're called in the ABS. And you can see that the younger profile, the older profile of self-contained retirement villages. It's important to understand a little bit about what's happened in the whole aged care field over recent decades, and even not so recent decades. The sort of things that have driven aged care policy in Australia include population ageing, which is pretty obvious, I think, to most people by now, with the percentage of 65s and over doubling between 2000 and 2050, and 85s and over quadrupling in that same period. And this means escalating costs to government of health and aged care. It means changing dependency ratios, which means the percentage of people that are in the workforce as to those in retirement, which places an increased burden on the younger population, working age population. There's also significant changing attitudes that have taken place in the last few decades, particularly as baby boomers have come into the ageing profile, because of their greater desire to remain active, independent, and certainly age in place. And on top of all that, we've got rising housing prices and affordability crisis, I think we could say at the moment in Australia, which means that affordable housing options such as land lease communities are really becoming more important. And we have also amongst the ageing population, pre-retirement and post-retirement ages, we have reducing home ownership and less mortgage-free retirees. So that adds even more to the kind of financial crisis for them and the need for affordable housing options. Now, there's been a whole raft of home care policy reform since about the mid-1980s, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I just want you to see how it steps up over time. The first home and community care program was introduced in 1985, and that was fairly basic services assistance around the home. Then very soon after, it was realised that that wasn't enough. So another program called the Community Options Program was introduced in 1987, which provided higher level services, brokeraged and case managed, different kind of approach. Not long after that, 1991, community aged care packages were introduced, and they provided equivalent to low-level residential care in the home. You can see here that what the government's trying to do is to prevent people transitioning into residential aged care because of the additional costs of that to the public purse. There was a change of government not long after that, and a new Aged Care Act was introduced in 1997. And the main theme in that was increased private sector providers and means testing and co-payments for recipients of aged care packages. Again, the following year after that, extended even further to dementia, high-level residential care and dementia care in the home. And you would think that when we got to that stage, things were going pretty well in terms of the transition, but the government commissioned a Productivity Commission report in 2011, which was pretty damning on the system as it had emerged. It identified a lot of problems and inequities, and it advocated a consumer-directed care approach to provide greater choice and control by consumers, and clearing what was then 100,000 plus waiting list. And the response to that was what was called the Living Longer, Living Better program. And this is the program that was introduced in 2013 under that banner. And it's the one that's still in place, but not for much longer. But where it is at the moment, it has four main components: the Commonwealth Home Support Program, which is the entry-level one like HAC. It has home care packages, which are more comprehensive services, and there are 4 levels of care in that: basic, low, medium and high care. And it's assessed by eligibility is assessed through an aged care assessment team, multidisciplinary team. There's also a respite care program and flexible care program for some other smaller alternative programs for specific groups, including remote Indigenous Australians. On top of that, again, another government came in, a Liberal national government came in, and it tended to have more of an emphasis on privatisation and on marketisation. And so we see that what they did in 2014 was introduced income testing to all new home care packages. And then 4 years later, income testing to all new and existing home care packages. So you can see that the process has become much more personalised and much more marketised. And of course, then what happened was the Royal Commission to Aged Care Quality and Safety, which was primarily triggered by some adverse situations in nursing homes. But it wasn't only about nursing homes. It was also, it also was a damning criticism really of the home care system. And these, some of the terms that we used in their initial report was cruel, discriminatory, unsafe, neglect, a lottery. They recommended a new, completely new Aged Care Act, a new single supported home program, and clearing what was then huge waiting lists, waiting times. They advocated for quicker allocations and extending acceptance times. In response to that, the government at the time proposed the discussion a new supported home program, and it was basically, you can see the components of it there, or the aspects of it there that are important. Single integrated assessment tool, short-term support for equipment and assistive technologies and home mods. Again, still very individualised with self-management of care and maximising choice of single or multiple providers in this particular case. Flexibility, and because there was some criticism about people being able to make choices, they introduced the idea of care partners as well to try and help people find their way through the system and find appropriate services. And this is proposed to come in under a new Aged Care Act in 2024. So we see the key policy shifts over time: change in the balance of care from residential to home care, increasing levels of home care service provision to dementia care in the home, increased marketisation of care through for-profit providers and competition via consumer-directed care, increasing user pays via means testing and co-payments, individualisation of care, greater choice and control through consumer-directed care. And the implications for this for retirement villages and land lease communities is pretty similar. They're basically treated the same as any people who live in any private dwelling in the general community. They're subject to the same application, assessment, and means testing and co-payments and CDC. Let's now look at the legislation, state legislation, territory legislation, see what it says about aged care. On the left-hand side, you'll see retirement villages. Every state, all 8 states and territories have specific legislation for retirement villages. They use consistent terminology, but they're quite inconsistent in their reference to aged care within those documents. I've got a list of 4 underneath there that show some of the ones that are more common, perhaps. Inquiry information disclosure documents regarding access to on-site residential care is covered in only half of those jurisdictions. Contracts, details and costs in terms of personal services available, which are important to older people, is covered in 5 out of 8 of those jurisdictions. Equipment modifications, only provision of emergency buttons and bracelets, only 1 out of the 8 jurisdictions. That's pretty important for people wanting to age in place. And relocation, departure and termination payment for residential aged care bonds from their exit entitlement, again, in only 4 out of 8 of the retirement village legislation. However, there is something there in most of them and more in some than others. When we get to land lease communities, it's quite a different picture. There's specific land lease community or similar named legislation in only 5 out of 8 jurisdictions. In the other 3, they're under general tenancy legislation. They use inconsistent terminology. You can see some of those at the bottom. Land lease communities in New South Wales, manufactured homes in home estates in Queensland, residential parks in ACT, South Australia, West Australia, and movable dwellings in Victoria. So they call them different things. There's little reference to aged care, and that's only in 2 out of the 8 jurisdictions. And they're fairly basic things. One is providing emergency and home care, emergency access and home care access by providing signage and a map. Pretty basic, really, so they can find their way in the village. And written notice of charges payable for services available only 1 out of 8 jurisdictions. And that's not necessarily specific care services either, just for any services. So really pretty thin on the ground in terms of regulation. When we look at why people move to retirement villages or land lease communities, we see, again, some interesting differences. Both of them somewhere near the top regard maintenance as an important factor in deciding to move in. But beyond that, they can be quite different. You can see that the 4th one in retirement villages has to do with health or requiring more assistance, which suggests a need for and an expectation for care services that would be available. That doesn't exist in land lease community reasons. They're mostly to do with maintenance, size of the home, and financially advantageous and other financial reasons. So again, some quite different motivations. Probably also reflects the different age profiles that we mentioned before as well. Press the wrong one, I'm sorry about that. When we look at in the literature at the aged care and other services provided, I should say that there's pretty good documentation in some of the academic literature on retirement villages. There's not much on land lease communities in terms of the services available. But some things we do know. So let's have a look at the top 2 aged care services that are significantly different between retirement villages and land lease communities. In 45% of retirement villages, the operator is also an accredited care provider and probably providing care for people outside the village as well. And 28% of them are co-located with residential care. So they have a continuum of care kind of model they could use. Whereas in land lease communities, that operators are not accredited care providers. In to anywhere near the same extent, probably not at all. And as far as co-location with residential care, that's very rare. I know it's in some of the more recent upmarket lifestyle villages, there is some co-location. But even then, what I've seen in the promotional materials, they don't mention the fact that they're co-located. I'll leave you to understand, to think about why that might be from a marketing point of view. If we look at, but it's not just about formal aged care services, it's also about some of the more supportive services for people aging in place. And in retirement villages, we know that 92% of them offer activity organisation. 75%, 3/4, emergency response. Hairdressing, transportation, meal services, visiting health professionals, all of those things are important for people. Transport, for example, is important if you're not able to drive, if you're not able to drive anymore. When we look at land lease communities, in terms of other services and facilities, it's mostly around recreational facilities. Again, partly reflecting the different age profile and possibly different expectations as well. Things like community centre is fairly common, social club and activities, swimming pool, tennis court, sometimes bowling green, barbecue areas, things like that. And of course, these vary quite considerably between the very affordable and older villages and the newer upmarket lifestyle villages, which can have quite a lot of these facilities and perhaps even more. And sometimes co-location with residential care. One thing I think that's interesting to consider is the issue of naturally occurring retirement communities, a term which comes out of the USA, defined by one author, Tremblay, as geographically defined areas with high concentrations of older adults with a critical mass varying, he says, from 25 to 65% and a threshold age from 50 to 65 years and older. But an Australian author, E. et al., or the team, have made an Australian definition, communities with 45% or more members of households aged 65 and over. If we take that definition, then many LLCs, I would argue, would qualify as NORCs, as naturally occurring retirement communities, with 56% aged 65 and over and 76% aged 50 and over. In fact, it well exceeds some of those thresholds. But NORCs is not just about concentration of older people in a geographic area. It's all about provision of health and aged care services as well. And in the USA, this has been championed in New York through the NORC social service programs. And these are all programs that are organised by the community itself or by other agencies or government or a combination of these to target services to these communities as communities rather than as individuals. Now, if we regard land lease communities as NORCs, which I think most of them probably are, residents may benefit from a more community approach to provision of aged care services through resident collective action or proprietors partnering with aged care providers to provide a more community-based sort of provision of aged care services. My question is, could this be an option under a new Aged Care Act and Supported Home program, or have we gone too far down the individualisation and marketisation track for that to be able to happen? Few conclusions. I press the right button. Land lease communities are an important affordable housing option for older Australians to age in place. Land lease communities and retirement villages, residents have similar rights and access to formal home care service. Not a lot of difference there. However, compared to retirement villages, there is virtually no recognition of aged care needs in state and territory land lease community legislation. Land lease communities are more often located in rural coastal areas with more limited choice of aged care provider and less access to transport, retail and medical services. While there are often social and recreational facilities in LLCs, there's a lack of other supportive personal services for older people to age in place provided by the owners and operators or through partnerships. Co-location with residential aged care is extremely rare in land lease communities, only in the upper market ones, a few other upper market ones. And land lease community residents are more vulnerable to tenure insecurity due to redevelopment and exit arrangements to alternative land lease communities or residential aged care is much more difficult in a land lease community than it is in a retirement village. Manufactured home, a final point is that manufactured homes are not classified as buildings. So they're not covered by the Building Code of Australia. They're mostly elevated off the ground. They're not subject to the BCA and its accessibility standards, which were just introduced recently. Even though New South Wales hasn't signed up for that yet, I'm hoping they will do in the near future. That's my conclusions. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Bruce. So we've got about 15 minutes for a Q&A. Maybe starting online, does anybody online have a question for either of our speakers?
No one yet, but can't find it. Oh, okay, here you go.
I've got a question for Ed. I thought your colour coding of the table was really interesting, especially all the red on the cultural policy column. But I'm interested, when you were looking at the policies, was it that the cultural policies were not dealing with ageing, or that the ageing policies were not dealing with cultural diversity, or was it both?
So it was primarily the first one. So one of the ones that actually dealt directly with diversity, whether they actually talked about aging as a concern as well. Yeah, so there are lots of kind of generic things that, oh, we need to recognize, diverse population, but then, aging or older people are not part of that conversation. So they're often left out of whatever programs and solutions and policies that are then drawn up out of those kind of policies, I guess.
Thanks.
Richard?
I'd like to ask you a couple. I think it's a very important issue, this whole aging. I mean, we all hope to be aged one day. Not we hope. So it does affect us all. And I, for one, would be very worried to be sort of in some horrible prison camp like thing where you feel isolated and alone and you just no one to talk to or get help from. So I want to know, what is the best policy directions that prevent that? Is it the funding model where it's right now very expensive to move, or is it that older people should be more integrated into the community, not isolated in retirement villages that are far from anything? Or is it technology where people can rate their thing, like schools get rated? What's the best policy that makes it incentivized that we don't end up in a prison camp one day?
Well, for some people like living in communities with people that are similar age. In fact, the satisfaction levels in LLCs are pretty good. And the community cohesion there is often good, people looking out for each other, supporting each other. So they can be quite supportive environments for people. There's also greater security in those kind of situations. So there's certainly reasons why people choose to live both in retirement villages and of course in retirement villages also for some of the ancillary services as well. So, but we've got to remember that it's only 5-point-something% of the older population that choose to live in them. So the vast majority want to stay at home and age in place. And so we should be doing everything we can to enable them to do that. And the new accessibility requirements in the VCA are going to be probably helpful for housing in the future to some extent for that, even though they're fairly basic provisions.
Yeah, I guess the original intention of aging in place is that you would want to be in a familiar environment that you want to live in, right? And you are given that choice. and whether it is, the people you already know or similar to you. But the point of, I think, both of what we have done is that we're not providing the setting that can happen quite easily, right? I remember when we did our downsizing project, a lot of people talk about, yeah, I want to downsize, but there's nothing affordable in my local area that I can downsize to, so therefore I don't. And that, even though, there's lots of government policies about, oh, we'll pay you extra stamp duty exemption, all those things for you to downsize in a smaller thing, but if there's nothing for them to move to, they're not going to move. So we haven't actually provided the right environment for people to do the things that they actually want to do and need to do. So they're stuck in somewhere that might not necessarily be the most suitable to them, just because they don't actually have other options to do that. Yes, you don't have to move into something and expect to be living there forever and ever, but also needs to suit your needs, at least for a reasonable amount of time, rather than constantly moving every 2 or 3 years. With things like land lease communities, for example, a lot of them are pretty, well, not necessarily poorly built, but basically carrying parks, right? But they don't have the structural integrity, for example, to take on things like, major modifications like a scrap room, because they just can't hold the things, right? You need something sturdy enough to hold your body weight, which is why when we looked at the analysis, that there is a disjuncture between who can access aged care services, because it includes full modification, right? So if you don't own your home, you're stuffed. If you live in one of those kind of flimsy things, you can't use those
It's not a
things.
building.
Yeah, which is not buildings, which is why they're always on a floodplain that get washed away. So, we don't actually have that environment to provide a nice place for people to want to stay.
Yeah, I was curious about that home renovation aspect that going through something similar with my mom, knowing that these renovations are necessary but are big ticket items, definitely, putting in an accessible bathroom or things like that are
Yeah.
big costs. So what kind of, and I know you mentioned, Bruce, that there's some funding in the name of it.
Commonwealth
Yeah.
Rent Assistance Program.
Yeah, it's how.
That's a rent subsidy for people on low incomes, and because they're leasing the site, residents, one of the great advantages to people is that they perceive themselves as being homeowners still, even though they're leasing the site. Because they're leasing the site, they're eligible for Commonwealth rent assistance.
Yeah.
Same as someone who's renting an apartment or something like that, or a house or something like that. It's not a huge amount, but it helps if you're on a minimum income or a pension, or the age pension.
Yeah.
And pretty well everyone on an age pension in these villages would qualify for Commonwealth rent assistance. So that's an attractor, for sure.
First one, so it's interesting to me. So you looked at 4 different areas, 2 regional and 2 sort of more city-based. So the city-based one's SA2, that sort of makes sense. But then Kiama, I was really interested looking at that as an SA2, particularly when you get more regional. So Kiama, I grew up down that way. It's heavily, I imagine aging in place down there would be heavily impacted by the fact that the 2 hospitals with emergency rooms down there are Shell Harbour and Nowra, which is about sort of 20 minutes in either direction, a little further south. So they would, for areas like that, would you look at, say, larger areas, or look at how it differs, like the further you get from those like little regional centres? Just because it's, as I mentioned, so Kiama itself, it's Kiama and Gerringong, which are sort of in that middle bit. They've got several sort of quite large residential aged care facilities. So there's support given like that. But if you're not part of one of them, if you're in your own home, and you've got something where I think you mentioned that one of the important things for aging in place, you might want to have like a one of the things you wear, a form on the top. If the ambulance is coming from 40 minutes away, that's pretty different. So yeah, just sort of wondering how it would sizes might be interesting to make larger as you got further away from the city.
Yeah, so the matrix itself was just based on population change. Service accessibility, we took the ARIA plus score, so it's general service rather than very specific to older people's needs. Aged care was really just a difference in terms of number of how many packages are in that area or not. So there's a lot of detailed analysis of who got to stay for that whole 10 years in the package. But yeah, I guess if we go back to the kind of regional setting, again, most of them would be in that kind of auto or exo, where it's very car dependent. So like you said, if the ambulance takes you 40 minutes to get to the nearest hospital and you're having a heart attack, then you're pretty stuffed. I mean, that would be the same in the city setting too. So yeah,
It's a big factor with lease communities as well, because quite a few of them are located quite remote from those kind of community retail centres and medical facilities and things like that. Yeah. So it's one of the significant differences between retirement villages and land lease communities.
Basically,
and it's based on land cost basically, because they're basically building them in caravan parks, upgrading caravan parks, and sometimes then selling them off later on, and everyone having to move out with great difficulty.
So the LLCs tend to be a lot cheaper than.
Yes, they're cheaper initially, but of course there's some other factors. You're going to be paying rent for the land, and you're going to be paying for other services as well. And also you've got a depreciating asset rather than an appreciating one, because it's the land value that's the main component of that increasing in value of homes. So yes, it's in the long run, it's probably not as affordable as it might seem at the beginning.
The contractual arrangements are also quite different. So we also just finished a report on retirement villages. What a lot of people find very difficult was the very different types of contracts that are specific to retirement villages compared to just a normal house that you would buy, because there is an exit fee component, right? That you give up a part of whatever the appreciation is, or the end up resale value is.
So does that mean they grab a chunk when you die? Is
when you exit? So whether you move to a different one
or when you die,
yeah, or when you die,
yeah. Generally on the assumption that you are buying in at a below market rate. So essentially they have a share equity to your property, right? So that's why they can take that chunk back.
It's called the deferred management fee, exit fee.
Oh, I don't see here.
It's about 20% of the value of the house?
Yeah, up to 20%. That is quite different to how we normally trade real estate. And so that is often quite a big point of contention when it comes to moving into something like this.
You think about also how in land lease community, how you might exit as well. You don't own the land, you own the house. So it's got to go through the proprietor. You can probably advertise it through a real estate agent, but the proprietor's got an interest in the land. And in some of them, there are some shared equity where the proprietor owns part of the house anyway. In some land lease communities, so exits are quite a bit more difficult in a land lease community. And if of course there's a redevelopment, which the proprietor has a right to do because he owns the land, and where do you move your house to?
Yeah.
How much does it cost you?
Yeah. So it's risky.
Is it worth anything? Because it's an older house that's been depreciated.
So to consider. Yeah.
Just want to make sure that there's no questions from anyone online. Last chance to ask or comment.
Hi.
Oh, hi.
Not a question per se, but I just noticed on one of the slides, aged care and other service providers, where it's got the comparison of retirement villages and land lease communities. The reference for number 4 was missing, so I'm just not sure what that one was.
Oh, sorry about that. I'm not, without looking at it, I can't remember what it was. If you email me, I'll tell you what it is.
All right, all good. Thank you.
All right, well, we might wrap it up there since we're a little bit past 5 o'clock. So I'd just like to thank Edgar and Bruce again for their presentations. Thanks very much. And then just to remind everybody that we have one more seminar left this term in 2 weeks. Ryan, pronounced his name wrong, so look it up.
And in Newland.
Ben in Newland is gonna be presenting in a few weeks, so please join us for that presentation, and we'll see you soon. Thanks again.